It's been a few months since we last looked at both emulation on the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 and the Yuzu emulator for Android. In just a few short months, Yuzu has been progressing at a blazing rate, and when we looked at it the first time, Yuzu had just seen its initial release for Android. Not only that, but there's been some fun developments in the retro handheld scene, and we now know that the AYN Odin 2 will be powered by the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, and so this video and all prior videos will hopefully serve as a great showcase of the capabilities of this very powerful Snapdragon. I've also been told I will be receiving a review unit of the Odin 2, and so we will be able to dive in deeper with the handheld and check out performance on it. I definitely recommend checking out Joey from Joey's Retro Handhelds, Stubbs from Retro Handhelds, and of course Russ from Retro Game Core's upcoming content with the Odin 2, which should be dropping today or not too long after this showcase. I will have all of their channels linked down in the description box, and I definitely recommend checking them all out and giving them a sub. So as we always do, please join me, the Retro Tech Dad, as we continue to explore the exciting possibilities of Switch emulation using one of the most powerful mobile chipsets on the market. Now before we dive into the game's showcase, I want to go over a few things and also cover the settings that I use for the games being shown here. As always, please understand that Yuzu for Android is in active development and is progressing at a very fast pace. What this means is that things like crashes, compatibility issues such as graphical glitches, and more are to be expected here. Not only that, but a game may be working here in this showcase but could very well not work in a newer version of Yuzu, which is why I will detail the specific build of Yuzu that was used to test all of these games. So for this showcase, we are using Yuzu for Android build 2921 A2426, which is an early access build. The test device to use here is the Red Magic 8 Pro with 12GB of RAM. Every game was tested using the Diablo mode, which locks the clock speeds of the CPU and GPU to their max. I've talked about how to enable Diablo mode on the Red Magic 8 Pro in my prior video, which I will have linked in the description and somewhere on screen if you want to know more. During the showcase, you will see that I have the clock speeds on screen which remain static because of that Diablo mode. We are using the Mesa Turnip Adreno drivers version 23.3.0. You can get these drivers from the Adreno Tools drivers GitHub page. I will have a link directly to the specific drivers that I am using here, as well as the GitHub repo, which has other drivers for many supported Snapdragon devices. Additionally, I am using Switch System Firmware 16.1.0, which can be attained from the Darth Sterny's firmware page. Again, this will be linked in the description below. Yuzu for Android doesn't require the firmware to be loaded, but it can help with compatibility, so I do recommend installing it. You will need to provide your own prod keys for Yuzu, but a quick search should get you to where you need to go. Every game in this showcase was tested using native resolution in handheld mode. So let's go over this build of Yuzu very quickly and get familiar with some important areas. There have been some nice additions since we last looked at the early build of Yuzu for Android, and now we have the option to do things like resolution scaling. I will go over any specific settings I have enabled here for this showcase. So let's quickly check out what's available to us in the settings. Here we can access the advanced settings option, which will be in a light gray font, so I do apologize if it's difficult to see on screen. We have several options here, and let's check out what each one has here. Under General, we have a few options that will remain untouched for this video. I only recommend making changes here if a specific game might require it. Under System, we have the option to toggle between docked and handheld mode. For the purposes of this video, we will leave this unchecked as every game was tested in handheld mode. The other options here should be left at default. Under Graphics, we have the ability to make use of that resolution scaling. As I mentioned, I tested every game using the native 1x resolution to keep things nice and simple for this showcase. I will demonstrate what resolution scaling could potentially bring in terms of performance at 0.5x native resolution later on in the showcase for Mario Kart 8. This does seem to be very game dependent, as I've noticed not every game will benefit from the resolution scaling in terms of performance. Moving down the list here, in the graphics section, I have set the aspect ratio to use the native 16:9. You can also choose to force 21:9 if you are on a mobile device like the Red Magic 8 Pro to stretch the image to make use of the full display. Moving along, I have Disk Shader Cache enabled and Force Maximum Clocks enabled, as we do have Adreno based graphics. Everything else will be left unchecked. For audio and debug, I have not made any changes in these sections and they remain at default settings. Now going back to the settings screen, there are a few other areas to pay attention to before we move on to the game's showcase. The first thing we will want to pay attention to is the install GPU driver. For this showcase, I have tested every game using those Mesa Turnip version 23.3 drivers. Once you have downloaded the drivers from the GitHub page linked in the description, you will then click on Install GPU Driver and hit the install option to point Yuzu to the directory where you have the file saved. For the GPU driver, you do not need to extract it and it can be loaded as is in its original zip format. You will receive a prompt from Yuzu saying it was installed, and you can double check this by clicking on the Install GPU Driver option to verify. The Select Games folder option will allow you to point Yuzu to the directory where you have your Switch games stored. Moving down, we have the Install Prod Keys option, and as I mentioned, you will need to supply your own prod keys, which is required for Yuzu. Finally, we have the option to install the firmware, which I do recommend doing as it will help with compatibility for certain games. The firmware I tested in this showcase was firmware 16.1.0, and I will have linked in the description where you can obtain the firmware. And so with that, I think we are ready to move on to our games showcase. I will have every game title displayed on screen, with 2 on-screen frame counters, as well as the clock speeds for the CPU and GPU, which is using the Diablo mode for the Red Magic 8 Pro, and is at the max clocks for the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. Every game in the showcase uses the base version without any updates installed. Alright, let's start this showcase with some Animal Crossing New Horizons, which is a very popular game for the Switch and definitely one of the heavy hitters for the platform, and considering it is the second best-selling game on Nintendo Switch with more than 40 million units sold, I think that statement holds some truth. My daughter adores this game and has put well over 300 hours into it. Animal Crossing New Horizons really surprised me with its performance using this build of Yuzu. This game stays pretty close to its target 30 frames per second frame rate and hovers around 28 frames or so. The game does seem to be quite stable, and I do think that many will be really happy to be able to play this one on Android. Now here's a fun one for arcade fans. Arkanoid Eternal Battle is a fun modern take on the Arkanoid formula and definitely worth checking out if you enjoy the series. There's tons of different modes here, and this is one that runs great staying locked at 60 frames per second as well as being very stable during playthrough. This will be one of the lighter games featured in the showcase, but I am always excited to introduce different games as well as showcasing a nice variety of games that is playable with Yuzu for Android. BloodRayne Betrayal is actually an older game that got re-released with an enhanced version for modern consoles, including the Nintendo Switch. This game is a really awesome take on the BloodRayne franchise, and personally for me, what drew me to this game years ago was its development, which was handled by WayForward, the same studio responsible for the Shantae franchise. Now I don't know if others feel the same way, but anytime I see a WayForward developed game, I immediately pay attention. Anyways, this game, as you could probably tell, is running very well with this build of Yuzu for Android and stays essentially locked to its 60 frames per second target with minimal issues and is also very stable.
The half-breed. Remind me again, why are we working on her?
The castle, remember? It takes a bloodsucker to catch one.
Guess there's a whole nest of them.
Cat Quest 2 is, as you might have guessed, the sequel to the original Cat Quest, which is a cute and well done action RPG. The original Cat Quest actually received a native Android port, but unfortunately this time around it did not make it over to Android, most likely because of it appearing on Apple Arcade. But thanks to Yuzu and emulation, Android gamers that were a fan of the original can now enjoy this one on their devices, at least one powered by the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. This one, while not running a consistent 60 frames per second, performed quite well, and I did find it to be pretty playable. This is a perfect case of where I'd love to see if the small boost in clock speeds on the CPU and GPU on the enhanced version of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 in the Red Magic 8S Pro would help out here. Additionally, I did not try lowering the resolution for this, but it's certainly worth trying to see if we can get enough frames to keep it stable. Dragon Ball FighterZ Z is a pretty awesome 2D fighting game based on the world of Dragon Ball Z, as you might have guessed. I was really impressed by the performance in this one, and I tested various modes, and performance is pretty solid overall despite not staying locked at 60 frames per second. I found that it didn't really affect gameplay all that much. This is one of the few that did crash occasionally on me during playtesting, but it does seem to be pretty random for me. You will also note that there are graphical glitches on the health bar at top, but otherwise I was pleasantly surprised that this one runs as well as it does with Yuzu. This is really exciting stuff to see here, and I think many Dragon Ball fans will be excited about this one. Next up is definitely an older game, but a very loved indie darling. If you haven't experienced Fez, it is definitely worth a playthrough with its very interesting gameplay mechanics that allows you to switch your 2D worlds on a 3-dimensional basis. Fez feels like such a good fit for Android, and truly I am surprised it never made its way natively to the platform, as it does seem to have been ported around quite a bit. My playthrough test did not reveal any issues with the game, and this is very stable and stays locked to 60 frames per second very consistently. This is another game that makes me so happy that Switch emulation is becoming so viable, as we can now enjoy this on Android. Fire Emblem Engage is another Nintendo published game for our showcase, and this will make many people very happy. The long-running Fire Emblem franchise, developed by Intelligent Systems, sees its latest game released earlier in the year and is the 17th game in the Fire Emblem franchise. I really love the presentation and art style for this one. I was honestly pleasantly surprised to see this one running as well as it is with this build of Yuzu. It's another game that seems to be quite stable with the settings being used for the showcase and stays mostly at its intended 30 frames per second target.
All right.
Final Vendetta is the perfect game for fans of old school beat-em-ups like Streets of Rage, which it is obviously heavily influenced by. This is easily the lightest game on this list in terms of visuals, but I am happy to report that this is a very smooth and enjoyable experience with Yuzu. I think Final Vendetta is the perfect fit for a mobile device or handheld, and so I'm really glad that this is now playable on Android thanks to the power of emulation. Here's one for rhythm game fans. Groove Coaster YY Party is a very interesting take on the rhythm game genre where you follow along on a coaster-type track on screen. My earliest experience with Groove Coaster was actually on mobile over on iOS, and I always found the concept fun and very enjoyable. The Switch version is a nice, full-fledged release and definitely a very solid entry in the series, and well worth it for rhythm game fans to check out. This is another very playable and stable game using Yuzu for Android. I am so excited to finally be able to include Hades in a Switch emulation showcase for Android, and to me it is now at a point where I'd say it's quite playable without any significant issues or graphical glitches. Hades comes to us from Supergiant Games and made massive waves when it was first released back in 2020, and for me, personally is one of my top games of all time. This is a real treat to see it this playable with Yuzu for Android, and as you can probably tell by the footage, runs almost always locked to its 60 frames per second target despite the action on screen. Better yet, I found it to be quite stable and did not experience any crashes with the game. Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity is definitely a fairly substantial game and heavy hitter for the Nintendo Switch. I honestly wasn't expecting this level of performance when I decided to test this game out for the showcase, and honestly I am very surprised I am able to include it here. Age of Calamity has this weird issue where the stage looks like it's not going to load properly, but if you hit start to bring up the menu and then hit start again, the world loads in properly. Go figure. So despite that weird issue, this one is surprisingly very playable and maybe more than I was expecting it to be. If you're not familiar with Hyrule Warriors, this is actually developed by Omega Force, better known for the Dynasty Warriors franchise, and you can tell that it does share similarities with that franchise and other hack-and-slash games from Omega Force. Age of Calamity is a fun game for Zelda fans and hack-and-slash fans alike. In my prior video, I featured Tears as a bonus game since it wasn't quite up there in performance. This time around, I wanted to showcase probably one of the most iconic games for the platform, and of course, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is probably one of the most important games that many will want to see or at least try out when doing some Switch emulation, regardless of the emulator or platform. And I have to say, I am honestly blown away by this performance and the fact that it is running as well as it is here. In my playthrough testing, the game was very stable, and I didn't notice any major issues during my playtime. I think this shows just how well Yuzu for Android is maturing, and it really just leaves me so excited for future development of the emulator. And of course, coming off the prior game, this one might not seem as impressive, but The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD is certainly worth including in this showcase. Not only that, we might as well keep going with the Zelda games, and so this is the first time I have shown Skyward Sword for Yuzu on the channel. Now, some might not be as impressed since this is technically just an HD version of a game that was released on the Wii, but the Switch version is still worth checking out since it does have traditional controls that many prefer over what we had with the Wii version. Regardless, I think performance here is still impressive, even though I knew it would be quite performant, and it's good to see compatibility is there with Yuzu for Android. The only issue I noticed were some minor graphical issues that appeared at times, but nothing I consider game breaking. Mario Kart 8 is actually the only game returning from my prior Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 showcase videos with Skyline and Yuzu. In the prior video, I included it as a bonus game since it wasn't quite up there in terms of performance. However, there's been quite a few versions since then, and this game does seem to be getting closer and closer to that 60 frames per second target, which to me is just freaking awesome. Remember, this is the only way we can play Mario Kart 8 on Android, as there is no way to emulate any Wii U games on Android at this time. So the first footage is of me playing the game at native resolution. Just for reference, compared to that earlier version of Yuzu, I am getting nearly double the frames now, which is just truly amazing. Not only that, for this game I wanted to show off what resolution scaling could potentially do for us in terms of improving game performance. I did find that for Mario Kart 8 it definitely helped us get a few extra frames overall, and so I'll let you be the judge to see if it's worth making use of that lower resolution scaling. The second half of the Mario Kart 8 footage is the game running at 0.5x native resolution, and on a smaller mobile screen or handheld size screen it still looks very good. Despite the game not reaching 60 frames per second, it's still very playable, and again leaves me so excited for the future of Yuzu because we are so very close to that 60 frames per second. Metroid Dread surprisingly hasn't been featured in any of my Switch on Android showcases, and so I think it's about time to include another very loved game. Personally, I was so excited when Dread was released and immediately ran to the store when it came out. It's a great return to the 2D side-scrolling style of Metroid, and for fans of Metroid, definitely well worth checking out. Metroid Dread has always been one of those showcase games that run well with both Skyline and Yuzu emulators. This one is pretty much locked to 60 frames per second and is very stable without many issues. I highly recommend checking this one out if you haven't already. Ms. Splosion Man is another older game that was an Xbox Live Arcade staple on the Xbox 360, and for whatever reason saw a re-release many years later for the Nintendo Switch. However, this is good news for us since that now means we can play this awesome game on Android with Yuzu, and this is another game that performs quite well. I did occasionally have issues where the audio will become distorted, but relaunching the game seems to resolve that problem. Outside of that, the game is staying locked at 60 frames per second, and if you haven't tried out this game or the original Splosion Man, I definitely recommend it as it's another personal favorite game of mine and it's the perfect pick up and play style game for a handheld and mobile device. Persona 4 Arena Ultimax is the direct sequel to Persona 4 Arena and, as its name implies, a spin-off of Persona 4. And I don't know about everyone else, but I'll take more Persona in any format. And Persona 4 takes the RPG series and turns it into a fighting game, and a pretty solid one at that. What's not to love about this game? You get more of the great characters from Persona 4, along with its great art style and soundtrack. Ultimax is another great game that we can add to the very playable list for Yuzu on Android, and another one that stays locked to 60 frames per second and is very stable. Pikmin 3 Deluxe is an enhanced port of Pikmin 3 from the Wii U. Now before I talk further about Pikmin 3, I will say that I did test Pikmin 4 and unfortunately the game has serious graphical issues and so it will not be included here in this showcase. However, I'm still very excited to be able to include Pikmin 3 Deluxe since again, we don't have any way to enjoy Wii U games on Android and this is the next best option. I'm really happy to say that Pikmin 3 is another game that is running very well right now with Yuzu and like so many other games in this video, runs well and stays at its 30 frames per second target. Pokemon Shield will be the only Pokemon game part of this showcase, and I did test a few other games including Pokemon Arceus which had graphical issues. However, Pokemon Shield is one that doesn't have too many issues. Performance seems to be quite solid with it staying at that 30 frames per second target. I did notice some minor graphical issues during my playthrough, but nothing that I would consider game breaking. Pokemon Shield is the first game in the 8th generation of Pokemon, and this is another game that my daughter has clocked some serious time into, and she is a huge Pokemon fan and has studied every page of the Pokemon Essential Handbook. Puyo Puyo Tetris 2 is the first puzzle game on our list, and this one is a blast combining the elements of Puyo Puyo and Tetris into one game, and it is developed by Sonic Team. I have logged some serious time into the original and sequel. Both games in the series are pretty meaty games featuring lots of different game modes including a solid story mode. It's obviously not a graphically flashy game, but for fans of puzzle games, this is one that is well worth checking out since it's the perfect match for mobile devices. Puyo Puyo Tetris 2 runs very well with no major issues and performance is locked to that 60 frames per second target.
Solved it. Solved it. Solved it.
This next entry is a very exciting one to include on the list and has been a pleasant surprise for me personally. Sea of Stars comes to us from the studio responsible for another great game called The Messenger and is actually set in the same universe as that game. This is a real delight for fans of classic JRPGs and is influenced by games like Chrono Trigger, Breath of Fire, and Super Mario RPG. However, one of the best things that Sea of Stars does is modernize the JRPG experience for a new audience to enjoy. This one is actually available on Xbox Game Pass, which is where I have been enjoying it, but this is a real treat to see it running this well with Yuzu for Android, and now allows so many more people to enjoy this on the Android platform. Interestingly, this one hovers around 45 frames per second, but given the gameplay style, it doesn't really seem to impact gameplay all that much, and I definitely consider this one pretty playable here. Outside of the frame rate, I didn't experience any issues with stability or major graphical issues. And here is another Tetris game making the list, but I'm not kidding when I say I absolutely adore Tetris Effect. I have played this game on both regular PC and VR, on the Quest 2, Switch, and countless other platforms. It is seriously one of my favorite variations of Tetris, and how could I not love this considering we have Tetsuya Mizuguchi behind this, who is responsible for countless other games I adore, like Rez and Lumines. This game is an experience, and really, this one comes highly recommended for me. I was so pleasantly surprised to see this one running at all with Yuzu, and despite it not staying consistent with frame rate, I did find it to be pretty playable, but I will let you judge if that's acceptable. I will say that I didn't experience any graphical issues or crashes during my testing, which turned into a much longer session than I was planning. The Tourist comes to us from severely underrated developer Shinen, who has turned out games like Iridian for Game Boy Advance, Nano Stray on the DS, Nano Assault, Fast Racing, and a lot more. The studio knows how to make fun arcade-style games, and so when The Tourist came along, this was definitely a departure for the studio, but a very welcome one since this turned out to be a great game. I originally played this one as part of the Xbox Game Pass on a whim, and I'm glad I did because I ended up finishing it in the same week that I started it since I loved it so much. The Tourist is an action-adventure game that uses a very unique graphical engine making use of voxel techniques. This is another game that doesn't quite manage to hit its target of 60 frames per second, staying mostly below that. However, given the style of the game, it is quite playable as is, and outside of this issue, is stable without any graphical problems as well. Now it's about time I include this game in a Switch on Android showcase. Untitled Goose Game is another absolute favorite game of mine, but this is one that my daughter and I both share a lot of love for. We absolutely love goofing around in co-op mode and being super trolly with the geese. I guess Untitled Goose Game is considered a puzzle stealth game, but for me it's mostly a run around as a goose trolling people in a town simulator. It's also got a very interesting soundtrack that is described as reactive music, which is tied to moments in the game with clips from Claude Debussy's Prelude. I am not even sure how this all works, but it really does work so well. Unfortunately, this is another one that hovers around 40 frames per second, and so it doesn't quite hit its target FPS, but again, for the style of game, I found this one to be very playable, and really, I think this is the perfect game for Android. Zombie Army 4 is probably one of the more graphically impressive games being featured here, and I took a chance on this one when I was going through my library of games. I really didn't expect this one to launch, and even if it did, for it to perform as well as it does here. Zombie Army 4 is a third-person shooter game that takes place in 1946 after the events of the Zombie Army trilogy. This series comes to us from Rebellion, who is also responsible for the Sniper Elite games. As you can tell by the footage, this one is locked at 30 frames per second and runs incredibly well here on Yuzu for Android. I didn't experience any crashing or graphical issues during my multiple playthrough testing's performance here. I was definitely pleasantly surprised by the results, and I think many will be happy to see just how far we can go with Switch emulation on Android. It's truly impressive. Now before we wrap this up, I've got some bonus games I wanted to show off here. Now these are not quite fully playable in my opinion, but I thought they were still worth including here, and hopefully we can track progress with Yuzu for Android similar to what I did with Mario Kart 8 and track its performance improvements over time. And just in time for Halloween next month, Pumpkin Jack is a fantastic action-adventure game that really reminds me very much of Medieval. The craziest thing about this game is the fact that it was mostly developed by one person. I originally played this one back when it was released for PC in 2020, and have also tried out this Nintendo Switch port, which I found to be very solid. The game combines a lot of cool gameplay elements and really feels like some of the other 3D platforming games from earlier generations. It's also a great game to play for the month of October, and I actually featured it in my Halloween special video last year where I covered various fun Halloween themed games to play. I definitely recommend checking it out if you're looking for some cool recommendations to play on various platforms. Unfortunately, the audio is broken in this game despite the excellent performance on hand here, and this is why I can't include it in the main list of games for this showcase. However, you can definitely turn audio down if you're okay with doing that, and the game is pretty playable. Blasphemous 2 is the sequel to the original Blasphemous game and is a side-scrolling Metroidvania-style game with a great art style. Performance is quite good with Yuzu and is stable. Unfortunately, you might have noticed that there is a weird graphical glitch at the beginning and end of a transition, and so I decided to include Blasphemous 2 as a bonus game since it's something glaring enough that some might not want to deal with when playing through the game on their device. Finally, the last game being featured here, and one I am pretty excited that runs at all with Yuzu for Android. Doom 2016 already was an incredibly impressive port to Nintendo Switch that shouldn't even have been possible, and now with Yuzu for Android, we are somehow able to play this game with that emulator on the Android platform, which is just absolutely mind-blowing to me. I found performance to be inconsistent with this one, unfortunately, despite it being stable and not crashing on me. But again, it's worth sharing the game here, and it's one I will definitely be tracking the progress with since this is a pretty high profile game. And with that, we're at the end of this showcase, and I do hope that this video will help everyone out. It's really impressive how far Yuzu has come since the last video just 3 months or so ago. I'm very excited to check back in a few months and see where we are with Yuzu again, and maybe we will be able to see how it holds up on the Odin 2 as well. But until then, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.